Did you ever see yourself starting an airline?
No, that was very unexpected. You start doing something and then opportunities present themselves.
You must be crazy to start an airline in Mexico.
And it's our goal still today was to take people out of buses and put them into the air is kind of the key to thinking about the growth of aviation overall. I wouldn't discount what happened between 1960 and 2020 in commercial aviation. I mean,
going from an 8-seater to a 400-seater.
Yeah, that's a pretty.
That's incredible.
It's an amazing change, and they created a really interesting aircraft. It's a really cool aircraft. In the process of stretching, the innovation became very expensive.
Yeah.
And, that's program risk that it's hard to burn off because the more technical stretch you do, the more unknowns there are.
Making the manufacturers fight with each other and being the first to have that aircraft made the difference and brought those, yields in.
Flying a mile in an aircraft, the capital cost of that is about 5% of walking around in your shoes. It's really kind of unbelievable.
So today we have someone I've been wanting to speak a while. We met back in San Francisco in September, and his story fascinated me. Known as the original founder of Volaris, and now he's working in the eVTOL space and helping other aviation companies get up and going as the managing director for Diamond Stream Partners. So, thank you so much, Dean, for coming. Appreciate it.
Great. It's great to be here, Luca. Thank you.
Tell us a bit about yourself and how did you get to where you are today?
I grew up in the Bay Area in San Mateo, which is what people now consider to be Silicon Valley. Although when I was growing up, people thought of Silicon Valley as much further south than that. I really got into transportation because in college I got interested in Toyota and the Toyota production system and wrote my undergraduate thesis on the Japanese economic miracle and how the Toyota production system was really central to that. And so went into manufacturing after school into a company called Ask Computer Systems, which was really run by one of the first great women entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, Sandy Kurtzig. And then after a few years of doing that, went off to Bain & Company. And at Bain, I worked in aerospace a little bit, worked in the F-16 plant, spent some time running the auto practice, which was a dream for me. Loved that, really interesting. And then got involved in aviation from there. So a long haul to kind of get into the aviation business. And then when I left Bain in 2003, I was one of the co-founders of Volaris. It took a team of people for sure, and I couldn't claim all the credit for it by any means. That really got me started on the operational side of the aviation business, and I just found it fascinating and have taken it from there.
Did you ever see yourself starting an airline?
No, that was very unexpected. You start doing something, and then opportunities present themselves, and so. When I was in South Africa running Bain & Company's Africa business, I had a very large aviation client down there, and I was also running the aviation practice at that time for Bain. We had a great relationship down there with one of the airlines, and the guy who ran technical came back to the U.S., and he got involved in a private equity business in Mexico. And he called me up one day and said, "Hey, Dean, I really think we should start an airline in Mexico. This is one of the last great markets that doesn't have a low-cost carrier." And so I was coming back to the U.S. at the time, and we talked it over, and we decided to get the airline started. And there's a whole story about how that worked that I can go into if you're interested. But that's really kind of the initial steps that made it go.
Yeah, no. Before you go into though, I remember you said one thing in San Francisco. You said, "Oh, your Mexican friend," I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, when I asked you about it, he said, I would have, he said you would never do it. You're a friend from Mexico, I believe, or one of your friends. And you said, "You must be crazy to start an airline in Mexico." And that was something that hit me still, and I still remember it now.
Well, that was actually, when we went, there was a group of us that were working together to get the airline off the ground, and we decided we needed an airline partner. And so we went and we pitched Roberto Crete at TACA. Actually, it turned out to be a 4.5-hour meeting in El Salvador where we talked this over and the benefit of starting an airline in Mexico. And I think Roberto was pretty excited about it, but Enrique Beltranena, who was his chief operating officer at the time at TACA, turned to me and he said, "Dean, what you must understand is Mexico is for Mexicans." In other words, you're nuts. And eventually we recruited Enrique to be the CEO of the company, which he's just done a fabulous job of. A few years ago, he got his Mexican citizenship, and when he did, he said, "Dean, you see, I'm a Mexican now. Mexico is for Mexicans." So he was right in the end. I was right for about 15 years first, though. So.
Yeah, he beat you to it. No, that was exactly. I was trying to, but I didn't catch it, I guess. But yes, that was it. That was what I remember.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, tell us how did it, the airline itself.
We had the meeting with Roberto and Enrique, and it was almost like a reunion of old friends. There were a number of people who had been in the Bain Airline practice that were working with Enrique and Roberto, and they were at the meeting. And Stan Pace was at the meeting, who was kind of the senior partner at Bain in the airline practice, who was a great friend and a mentor to me, and who's on the board at Volaris now. There was kind of our side of the table, which was Kevin Wilson, myself, Harry Krensky, who we were working with, and Pedro Aspe, who was the former finance minister of Mexico. And so at the end of that meeting, we all decided to further explore it. We put together a term sheet, and then really it took about a year and a half to get the company funded. We worked on the business plan together. At the end of 2005, we closed the initial funding for the deal. And in the process, we recruited 2 Mexican partners. We recruited Carlos Slim, and we recruited Emilio Azcárraga, which is, Televisa, or Inbursa and Televisa, respectively, which are 2 of the biggest, most important companies in Mexico. So we really had sort of the local presence, which I think was very important. They were very good partners while they were in the deal. And then we had the airline expertise. And that's a great investor combination to start a business. And there are a lot of reasons that Volaris worked. One of the reasons was we had the right investors who understood the business, understood the country, and then we had a management team that understood the business model, and that's really made the company successful and turned it into a great company. Aviation goes up and down, but if you build a great company, you'll manage through all those ups and downs, and the downs will become opportunities for you, and obviously you celebrate the ups.
So was one of those ups feeling like you became Mexican?
No, I wish. I'm still working on my Spanish.
Well, maybe then you feel a bit more Canadian, I guess. I don't know, because you were saying there was some WestJet connection with Volaris. What is this WestJet?
Yeah, so, as we built our investor group, for our side of the transaction, we wanted people who had a high degree of experience in the aviation industry, who could help us with relationships, who could give us advice. So we got Ed Acker, who was the former CEO of Pan Am, was one of our investors. Don Garvett, who I had known out South African Airways, where he was kind of the chief commercial officer for a while, and then he went to Alaska. Really one of the world's great experts in revenue management. And Mark Hill, who was one of the founders of WestJet, and who is just a great entrepreneur and a great guy. And so very early days at Volaris, we had Mark come down, and we had a strategy session with the team and a lot of the investors. And we talked with him about what we should be doing. And he talked about his experience at WestJet. And really, he had great ideas on culture, about how to engage with the people more. And at the time, the aviation business in Mexico was very stuffy and very hierarchical, which I think was a feature of Mexican business back in those days. And so Mark basically told us, "Hey guys, let your hair down, have fun." And Enrique, I think to this day, I think it's sort of his nature anyway, but to this day has really engaged with his team and his company, and plays soccer with the guys and everything like that. So that was one takeaway we took from WestJet. But the other was, something that Indigo, when they came in, also reinforced was play your game. Don't play the game of the guys that are already in the market. So, we were trying to decide whether to focus on Western Mexico or whether to focus on kind of the golden triangle in Mexico between Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City. And Mark, was very, very emphatic, saying, hey, guys, you should really focus on Western Mexico. Go after Tijuana. You'll be catering to your market, which is, middle-class Mexicans, and don't worry about the business market. That's Aeromexico's market. That's Mexicana's market. You go after your customers. And that was terrific advice.
You just made another connection. I don't know how you do it, but you're really beating me to my questions, I guess. Indigo also played a role. So because Bill Franken, he's the founder of Indigo Partners, and humongous group playing a big role in LCCs across the world. How was it with Bill Franken and setting it up, and what was your relationship?
In 2010, really for internal reasons, our Mexican partners in Bursa and Televisa decided that they wanted to leave the business. And, we were sorry to see them go because they were terrific partners for us. We needed a new capital partner to replace, the money that they had put into our capital structure. And so we went and we looked at a variety of different partners there. And ultimately, Indigo turned out to be the right partner, both because they understood what we were trying to do, and they had tremendous expertise in the low-cost carrier area. So they not only understood it, but they helped us extend it. The existing investors raised some additional capital, and we brought in Indigo, which also brought in capital, and we replaced Bursa and Televisa. It's been just a terrific relationship with the Frankies. Bill doesn't spend as much time with the company as he did at the beginning. Brian, his son, is the chairman, and they've added tremendous value to the company over the years.
I always thought of Bill. I've heard so much about Bill, and I always think of him as a sort of a Crandall type. But he taught other people in the industry to become the next leaders, like Scott and Doug, like Doug Parker, Scott Kirby. Do you think that's true? What do you think of that? With how he's has he made other leaders in Volaris like that?
Well, I think it takes a team. Indigo is not one person. Bill's obviously the founder, but there's a lot of expertise and capability because all they do is focus on low-cost carriers, and so they understand fleet management extremely well. They help to orchestrate the large purchase order across all the low-cost carriers in their group with Volaris. They do sharing between all the airlines. And it really gives them a unique perspective and a depth of expertise as a team that I think is very, very helpful. And so, I think that the management team and frankly, the investor group has learned a lot from Indigo, and I'm personally deeply appreciative of their participation in the deal.
What was like the biggest difference between starting an airline in Mexico versus the U.S. other than culture, of course? We're not that great in soccer. That's undoubtedly true.
Obviously I haven't started an airline in the U.S., so I can't really compare, but there are a lot of differences that I think we face than a startup in the U.S. would face. The U.S. has a number of very well-run, very, very large carriers, including low-cost carriers. When we started Volaris, most of the market was Aeromexico and Mexicana, and there were a number of small carriers. Most of them were subscale, undercapitalized, and not particularly well-run, which is evident in the fact that most of them went out of business over the next decade. And really, we also started at a time that a number of other new carriers started. And so there was sort of a wave of 5 or 6 carriers that all started at the same time. And so that's just a very different competitive dynamic than existed at that time in the U.S. The market's much smaller. The other thing about the Mexican market is that when we entered, and one of the reasons that we entered was that you had 2 legacy carriers, kind of network carriers, that were increasing prices every year, and volume was essentially flat. And penetration of aviation services was very low. In the U.S., the market had already been stimulated to a significant degree by that time by Southwest and other carriers, and penetration was relatively high. So our job in Mexico was really to grow the market. And we did that by switching people off of buses. When we entered Mexico, and this was partially because the Mexican carriers were so expensive, Mexico had the largest bus market in the world. And so our goal, and it's our goal still today, was to take people out of buses and put them into the air. And this sort of notion of mode substitution between different forms of transportation that I really kind of internalized at Volaris is kind of the key to thinking about the growth of aviation overall. And as we get into the discussion about next generation aviation, I think it's a really important factor in how you frame out where the opportunities are and where the opportunities are not. Volaris did, I think, a very, very good job of understanding that the market could grow a great deal by focusing on people that were underserved. And that's the strategy to this day. And the proof is in the growth of the market. So in a little over a decade, Volaris and the other carriers that entered the market at that time tripled the size of the Mexican aviation market. And that's quite an achievement. And we did it by reducing fares and stimulating the market and making it affordable for ordinary people. And I feel very, very proud of that. It's really a people's airline, not a business person's airline. And it's changed the lives of many people who either emigrated inside Mexico or moved to the United States and want to see their family back in Mexico. Previously, it was just impossible for them to come back to their home more than once a year or once every few years. And now they can do the same thing, cheaply and affordably. And it's changed their lives.
So you would say that obviously Volaris was a typical airline success story.
I mean, I think it's one of the bigger LCC success stories out there. Volaris is the market leader now. And there are not many markets in the world where the low-cost carrier turns out to be the market leader. And it's the market leader without having wide-body service. So, if you just looked at narrow-body service, it would be the market leader by a long distance. So, yes, I think it's a great success story. It's a great company. The airline business is a very volatile business. There's a lot of challenging things that are out of your control when you get into the airline business. But if you build a great company, you build it on the fundamentals, you treat your people right, you treat your customers right, you'll have an enduring franchise that gets through all those ups and downs.
What about, going into Volaris today? There's the whole thing, I guess, the president, with wanting to move carriers to the new airport in New Mexico City. And also today, Airmar just shut down today.
Yeah, Airmar shut down yesterday, I think, yeah. So the market continues to change. Mexico City does need a new airport. I don't want to comment too much on that because that's really current company business. Yeah. But, we try to be supportive of what the government's doing. We also need to make money as we do that, and so we try to balance those things. But the market's consolidated a lot over the last decade, and now we're really down to 3 main carriers, and that's down, I think, from 14 when we started. So it's a big change.
You laughed at this one too. I mean, can you make fortune in the airline?
Yeah, I think you can make money in the airline business. Yeah, I mean, and people. The truth is, people have done it and continue to do it. So I think we'll see a number of people, make more money in the commercial airline business in the future. The place where I think more airline fortunes are going to be made over the next 2 decades, though, are in the emerging aviation segments, which I know we're going to talk about, and that's what I'm focused on right now, just because there's going to be so much growth and so much opportunity in those areas. And I think if you talk to many people in aviation, especially at Revera, which is a little self-serving, but they'd say that aviation's entering a phase where there's going to be more technological and business model innovation than we've seen probably since the beginning of the jet age, which is, a very exciting prospect to me. And having been in the aviation business a long time, as I saw kind of the underlying technological changes that are going on here, I got very excited about that and wanted to spend, the rest of my career helping to advance this next phase of the aviation and aerospace business. It's very exciting.
No, you really brought that whole energy to the table, because I was also speaking with Kevin from Empire. My favorite example always is how, when you look at aviation historically, when Pan Am started off with its Central America operations to Nicaragua, they had 8-seater propeller aircraft. But by the 60s, they had the 747. An incredible amount of innovation in just 30, 40 years. And we haven't seen anything like that. And now it's probably the same thing, right? It's just it's history repeating itself.
Yeah, and I wouldn't discount what happened between 1960 and 2020 in commercial aviation. I mean,
going from an 8-seater to a 400-seater.
Yeah, that's a pretty.
That's incredible.
It's an amazing change. But in terms of opening up new markets, where commercial aviation has been incredibly successful, is serving markets over 500 miles. And, freight is even a longer haul market for the most part. And commercial aviation's, probably got 40% share just on the passenger side of trips over 500 miles. But when you get under 500 miles, aviation is not very successful in terms of penetration. It's got about 0.4% penetration of passenger trips, but that's 80% of the trips over 50 miles. And so if you think about that and you think about the opportunity that's in front of us, we really, over the last 50, 60 years, we've really perfected that opportunity over 500 miles. And it is the world's most efficient, largest public transportation system. It's safe, incredibly safe. It's like nothing the world's ever seen. I think people underappreciate it. But under 500 miles is all virgin territory for aviation. And yet, I think over the next decade or two, we're going to see aviation advance rapidly in providing solutions in that area. It's very exciting.
I guess that just brings us on to our next part of the discussion. You're talking about eVTOL. So something that's really interesting to me, there's all these small towns along the coast in Europe or even in the US, which are not close to an airport or because of the terrain. Because at least in Europe, there's a very big regulations that block anything. That would probably a lot of bureaucracy to ensure that those types of operations are, because of noise and on the water. What do you think we could still see that?
I think there's lots of opportunity. If you sort of think about what works today in our transportation system very effectively, under 50 miles works really well for ground transportation because you're not going that far. You don't need high speed and you need point-to-point connectivity. Over 500 miles, I think works very, very effectively. Between 50 and 500 miles is sort of a tough area. And so that area is not only a difficult situation for transportation because either you have sort of poor air connectivity, lower frequencies, pretty expensive, not a lot of route density, and for cars, no one likes to sit in a car and drive 300 miles, especially when you have to go, traffic out and traffic in on each end. And so it's really kind of a difficult area. And you see urban development mirroring the transportation options. So you have these huge urban areas. They start to get very difficult to manage over 50 miles, from the core. LA is probably at the max end of that. And then you've got commercial airports, basically 150 of them, which take up about 95% of the traffic in the US at least, connecting these urban centers, and everything in between is relatively impoverished. And so I think there's an opportunity for aviation to help change that dynamic and kind of fill the gap into these different communities. Now, there's a lot of barriers, and you were starting to talk about some of them: noise, regulation, and so on, and frankly, just local opposition to things that doesn't have anything to do with anything rational. It's just they just don't want that there.
Don't want anything.
Yeah, and so I think some of these things are going to happen faster than others, but my view would be economics usually win out over time. And so if you offer people a better solution and a more economic solution, water eventually wears down the stone and you'll end up at those locations. That can take a very long time. If you've ever read about the third man controversy in aviation around the flight engineers, it took 30 years to get rid of the flight engineer on aircraft when they really weren't needed. And so, in aviation, you always need to be very, very sensitive to how long things are going to take and try to go with the things that'll take shorter times and that can be implemented quickly. And that'll set the table for the things that are going to take a little longer.
Taking into consideration that part of time, I guess one of your competitors, partners, is they focus on aviation companies, but they try to make sure that it's not dependent on certification.
Yeah.
At some points, something it's just the truth that they have to, it's going to be an uphill battle to try to get certified, especially in aviation. So you don't have any doubts, right, on investment in the future of aviation, right?
I run an investment fund in the future of aviation, so I have no doubts. But I think the way to think about it is probably more broadly than just certification. Certification is one step on the way of getting to market, but there are many steps to get to market. And when you have a group of aerospace engineers or people who are focused on building an aircraft, and after they get their design done, the next step is to get certification done. And people have put a lot of money into it, and they can't sell that aircraft until the certification's done. They're going to focus a lot on certification, right? Mm-hmm. But really, the table for certification is set in the aircraft design. And if you create an aircraft design that's very difficult to certify, certification is going to become a bigger issue for you. If you do something that is not that complicated, certification's less of an issue for you. So the pieces of it that I think have been underemphasized in terms of time to get to market are, for airframers at least, are the design itself, right? And so if you go, for example, and go through Joby's plant, which is really a marvel. I mean, it's an amazing facility down in Marina, California, and you look at what Elroy's doing, they've taken very different technological paths because of design choices. So Elroy has a hybrid electric system, so they have a lot of power and they have a lot of range, or they use some of that power and range because of the propulsion system to not stretch as far on kind of the design of the aircraft. So it's not all carbon fiber composites. It's not lots and lots of titanium parts, or as many titanium parts that are made through additive manufacturing. But when you go to Joby, you see there's lots of carbon fiber. Everything's made out of titanium because the weight limitations and the power limitations from the battery drive them towards more aggressive design parameters. And that, in turn, impacts the certification pathway, right? So this whole certification issue starts with design. But once you get the aircraft in service, whether it's through a waiver or, in Europe, you get some kind of SORA authorization to fly, which is kind of the second part of certification, not the aircraft certification, but the operational certification. Then you actually have to build the market out. How the market builds out really depends not so much on whether you have an aircraft or a certified operation, but how fast and how willing the customers are to adopt. And this piece of it, I think, has been underemphasized in the discussion in the industry to date. It's one thing, for example, to develop a new version of the A320, like the A320neo. You've got an established network. You've got, maybe a 20% fuel savings. You've got, for commercial aviation, a huge economic impact, right? And you know exactly where you'll put those aircraft as soon as you receive them. It's another thing to invest in a UAM concept that doesn't really have a set of carriers that operate today. There's no network that does that today, which is, why some of the companies are building out their own networks, or why, the people, some of the investors in Beta also invested in Blade, right? Because they're looking for a way to actually commercialize those aircraft. And then how are you going to bring that aircraft to market? How are you going to build a network around that? How are you going to build a safety case around that? Because the operator has huge downside if they bring in a new aircraft, do a big aircraft order, and one of the aircraft crashes, either because they don't understand that aircraft that well and how to operate it, or because there's some safety issue with the aircraft, or whether the pilots are not as comfortable with that, whatever it happens to be. And so you're naturally going to want to take something like that slower. So there's a lot of considerations in terms of how quickly you get to market. And, a couple of those considerations that I think are, really important have to do with kind of the underlying dynamics of stimulation, which, we can talk about. But certification is important. There's obviously the platform certification and the operational certification, but sort of the market development piece is really, really critical. And I think often under discussed in our industry.
And you think Empire has succeeded in that very well?
They haven't put their product into market yet.
Sure.
But I like the concept that Kevin has. Kevin's idea is I can take 30 or 40% out of the operating cost of a Caravan. And operating cost is only part of the equation. And by retrofitting aircraft, two premises there, right? First, he's on a faster certification path, because really what he's doing is he's taking an airframe that already exists and he's putting a new propulsion system into it. So that should be faster than designing a whole new airframe. But the second thing is I'm going to take people who are already operating an aircraft, they're familiar with that aircraft, and I'm going to basically re-engine it. It's a new propulsion system. And so they don't really have to change their operating procedures very much. And they'll be able to utilize that new propulsion system and enjoy the benefits of that lower operating cost. So it's a great way to get to the market faster. You get stimulation effect by reducing the costs of the aircraft operations. You can get there faster because you're using an existing airframe, and you should get good adoption, both because you're offering much lower cost, but also because people are already familiar with that aircraft and it fits into their existing concept of operations. That's a good example of a relatively fast route to market.
Considering how fast it's going to market, I mean, with the whole certification process, from what we've heard from Kevin, do you think that's more important to be first, or to have a more innovative product that takes more time? And that goes back to what you were saying with the whole, we have to keep in mind. I believe you were talking about one company that they wanted to perfect what they had, and in the end it took much time, and then they couldn't pay for those. They couldn't bring it to market. So what do you think what's more important?
Yeah, so I'd say it's the wrong way to think about it. So it's the wrong question. That's what I'd say. It's sort of a false trade-off. You need the disruptive economics to get adoption. You need to consider the other factors beyond economics that will get you adoption, and then you need to think about the trade-off between getting disruptive economics and how long it's going to take and what the risk is in the program. So if you look at, say, Icon, which is a sports aircraft that came out a few years ago, they stretched technically to get something that had some pretty attractive economics to it. And, they created a really interesting aircraft. I mean, it's a really cool aircraft. But in the process of stretching, they ran out the timeline to actually build the aircraft, rolled up the capital costs, and the innovation, became very expensive.
Yeah.
And that's program risk that it's hard to burn off, because the more technical stretch you do, the more unknowns there are. One of the things I like about what Dave Merrill's done at Elroy is he's doing an eVTOL aircraft, but he hasn't overstretched to do it. And so I think the timeline risk around the aircraft and the capital risk associated with extending the timeline is much lower than if they had really tried to push the edge of the envelope. And it's frustrating, especially for people who are in Silicon Valley who are used to just like, hey, let's really go for it and leapfrog. A lot of aviation is about capital cost dynamics and utilization. And capital cost dynamics start with the cost of the aircraft, and they finish with high utilization. You need to, when you're designing that aircraft, you need to make sure you can keep the capital cost down, and then you need to make sure that the adoption rate and the utilization rate and the scale of deployment of that aircraft is going to be high to amortize those capital costs up front. And you need to figure all of that in at the same time. And boy, if If it means getting to market a little bit later, but having lower capital cost and targeting a market where you have a bigger element of disruptive economics, that's going to be a great choice.
I see what you mean with Elroy and Empire, but the reason I always, I guess, think about first, I love to connect with Pan Am. Pan Am, my favorite airline. Doesn't help with anything today, but the lesson I always got was that, making the manufacturers fight with each other and being the first to have that aircraft made the difference and brought those, I guess, yields in. But I guess it's a completely different marketplace, of course. Or does that have any relevance with today's aviation world? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. If you're thinking about an aircraft and making it commercially viable, and I know you have some questions about, aircraft flying in different weather conditions and different environments. One of the most important things is to generate a lot of flight hours. One of the mistakes that people, I think, in the drone business made 10 years ago when, everyone was excited about the drone business is they were thinking about it more as like a toy. It came out of the radio controlled helicopter business. A lot of the people, they were excited about it, and commercial aviation applications, beyond the airlines, but any commercial aviation application is really about asset utilization. And so, the reason that commercial aviation has been so successful is, flying a mile in an aircraft, the capital cost of that is about 5% of walking around in your shoes. I mean, it's really kind of unbelievable. And so to get that, you have to have incredibly high levels of reliability. And so, at Volaris or at other airlines, people are typically flying completion factors at 99% or so. And, we're invested in a company that does build drones. And, when we were talking with them about their company history, they said, boy, when we started this, we didn't realize how important it was. And some of that's baked into the design, some of it isn't. If you can't get that asset reliability through the flight hours, and you get that through hard work by measuring every single reason the aircraft doesn't fly and correcting it systematically, and you don't get the flight hours and the measurement together and the culture of fixing things, then you end up with an asset that can't fly all those hours, and it ends up being much more expensive to deploy. Mm-hmm. And so, these are kind of the underpinnings of creating a successful commercial business. So being first matters because you can generate a lot more flight hours. And this is why the Ukraine matters, because one of the biggest challenges that aerospace companies have is there's so many restrictions on flying. It's actually hard to get a place to do test flights. It's not like, hey, I'm just gonna go fly my 1,500 pound drone around. That doesn't happen. Like, you actually have to figure out how you're going to do that and be permitted to do that. Now you take a look at the Ukraine, and it's kind of like, regulation, schmregulation. If you give that to me and it's going to help me fight this war, like, I'll fly it today, and I'll fly it as many hours as I can in a day because I have an unbelievable sense of urgency. So in terms of unmanned flying, I think we're making about a year of progress for every month of war in the Ukraine because the flight hours are accumulating so fast.
Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, and looking forward to seeing you on the next episode.